Lucas from iExplore here, and today we're going to explore Yanaka, which is this cool little area behind me, famous for its little shops and streets, very local. I'm going to use my 40mm f2, which is basically my new favorite lens, and I also want to talk about a few interesting topics, or topics that I find interesting in relation to photography, and that's mindfulness and flow. But more on that later. First, I need to tell you that we have an official sponsor for the first time ever. We have a sponsor, and that sponsor is portraitmode.io, which is a photo sharing website, and also they will soon have an app for Android and iOS. And it's basically like an alternative to Instagram, because Instagram, as we all know, is not so much about photos anymore. It's become more general social media. While on portraitmode.io, the emphasis is the photography, and specifically street photography. And also I like the way they really try to promote the individual photographer, so they have like a featured photo section, which is sort of like an editor's choice on the front page. So if you post your photos, they might get featured on there as well. So I hope to see you guys on there. Also, don't forget, we do have a Patreon, so check that out. But anyway, let's get on to the video.
iExplore.
So, as I mentioned, I want to talk about mindfulness and flow, but before that, I think we just should explore this area a little bit, because it's really cool, and just get into shooting, and then I'll talk about those things in a little bit as we go into the more quiet side streets. Now, as you can see, this area is like a kind of a famous, not famous, I mean, it's pretty famous for Japanese. It's not that famous for tourists. When there are tourists, they don't come here so much. Oh, this lady's kind of interesting. But it's like a very local sort of hangout where the people who live around here, they come, they shop or whatever, and there's a lot of like little sweets shops, ice cream shops, and things like that. The area is called Yanaka, but the main train station is Nippori, for those of you who want to know a little bit about the terrain in Tokyo here. And finally, this specific street is called Yanaka Ginza. I'm going to shoot this stuff right here. This conglomeration of colors is very nice. I like the yellow, the green, and the silver of the latter there. Let's keep going. Okay. So my goal here is to keep an eye out for just interesting street moments, but also just interesting light and colors and things like that. Not necessarily only about street photos. You know, these kind of tight spaces are a little bit tricky with the 40mm, because it's kind of tight here. But we're going to make it work. But anyway, so I think I can start going into what I was saying about mindfulness. So those of you who've maybe heard this term, and I know I've mentioned it in previous videos, it's a kind of, mindfulness is often referred to as a kind of meditation, right? But whether it's meditation or not, mindfulness is the idea that you pay attention, close attention to the present moment, right? You don't let your mind wander and daydream and go off and, get distracted by things, or worrying about something that's going to happen, or dwelling on something that happened in the past. That would be the opposite of mindfulness. Mindfulness is the idea that or the technique, I suppose, that when those thoughts arise, hold on a second, then you don't judge them. You let those thoughts, you accept them. Okay, I had that thought, but then you let it go. You let go of the thought. You don't dwell on it. You don't want to focus on a worry or whatever it might be, and bring yourself back to the present moment. And usually, people do this through focusing on things like their breath or something, right? By the way, in this case, I just like how all these different patterns, like the lady's jacket, the other lady's hat, the background. There's just a lot of patterns and colors, and that makes it interesting. It doesn't seem the same. So usually when people do mindfulness or meditation, they focus on their breath, some physical sensation. But how does this apply to street photography? Well, the way it applies is, instead of focusing on something internal, like your breath, you focus instead on your surroundings, right? On what's going on around you. And you have and right now I'm not doing a very good job of that because I'm talking to you guys, and we're so in the way. Let's keep going. We'll keep going. I think we've shot this enough, because there's a lot of activity here. We'll move on. So the way mindfulness applies to street photography for me, or even any kind of photography, is that instead of focusing on something internal, like my breath or whatever, I'm focusing on my surroundings, right? Which is very hard to do because there's a lot of stuff going on, plus I'm trying to narrate my thoughts to you guys. These dogs are great as well. Oh, I just tell everyone their dog is cute. That's the way to do it. I just take a photo and say, it's a cute dog. This shop is really cool as well. Here I might actually slow the shutter down because it's quite dark. Let's see here. So on the streets, instead of focusing internally, I focus on the external, which I know I've repeated like 3 times now because there's so much action happening. But by doing that, when I'm not narrating a YouTube video, when I'm just walking around doing my own thing, I can maintain that same kind of mindfulness approach, or like meditation, where I tune out those other thoughts, and sometimes I'll get distracted and my mind will wander and I'll start thinking about some thing I have to do later, or something that happened yesterday, or I said something stupid or whatever. But I try to remind myself, okay, bring it back. Just bring it back to focusing on the surroundings. Don't think about that stuff, okay? And later on, I'll mention some tips for how to, kind of practice this technique. But for now, just talking about it broadly, okay? And also, I think we should take a break here and have a gelato. What do you think, Axel? So, since we're talking about mindfulness, let's talk about mindful eating, which Axel just mentioned I should talk about, but he's joking. But I actually do this when I eat something like a sweet. I don't understand this, like when someone's looking at their phone, but then also like eating delicious food. Put the phone away, enjoy the food, like mindfully, right? So when I eat something like this, I try to really think about how good it is and how I'm enjoying it, because then it like feels like it lasts longer, and then I feel more satisfied afterward. Anyway, gelato break. It was very mindful gelato eating, but now we're back to shooting. And actually, there's something right over here that caught my eye. It looks really beautiful. I love these kinds of color compositions. Beautiful colors in there with that light coming from behind. That's gorgeous. Just making sure it's sharp because it's kind of hard to see what's even going on in there. Beautiful. And what I would be hoping for is if somebody came like on the other side of these tarps and cast a shadow, a human-shaped shadow on them. That would be really good. All right, so now that it's going to calm down from here, I figured it was going to be way too much going on in that main street to really have like a meaningful conversation or I guess explanation of these ideas. But so far I think I've made myself pretty clear, but just to recap essentially, that mindfulness when it comes to photography, is the idea that you stay focused on the moment of what's happening around you, which is kind of what street photography is about. That's how it plays into things. That's why it fits. To me, it totally fits with what I'm doing when I'm doing street photography. So when I learned about mindfulness in the context of meditation itself, it made sense to me. It was very attractive because I realized, hey, this is exactly what I'm already doing, but I can refine it a little bit and, apply it very consciously to what I'm doing when I'm doing street. So now when I walk around, I try to employ that mindfulness kind of mentality. There's another mindful photographer right there. Actually, I'm going to shoot the same thing because that building looks really nice. So I try to look around and I try to think about, what is, not even what is around me, because that implies there's some sort of a goal. It's just, I accept what is there. The very important thing about mindfulness is that it's about no judgment. So I don't judge what's there. Like, I don't look at something and say, this is no good, or I try to find something. I just go out and I observe whatever's in the present moment. And if I can photograph it, great. If I can't photograph it, that's okay too. It's not a big deal. Sometimes I miss a shot. Sometimes it just doesn't look good or worth photographing. It's just worth seeing or looking at, right? But you don't really know if you're going to actually have a good photo of it at the end or not. So just the act of seeing is what you're really doing. And I know I've mentioned this in other videos before, but that's mindfulness, right? Okay, and then it applies to other things, like I was saying earlier about the gelato, like with eating, right? To reiterate that, it's easy to kind of be distracted while you're doing something like eating, when really you should be focusing on that thing. So street photography is like a training system for mindfulness. If you can do it in this chaotic environment to stay focused on your environment and your surroundings, then you could probably do it in other less chaotic environments as well. Right. Now I know it's kind of ironic because I'm really not demonstrating very good mindfulness right now, as I already mentioned, because I'm lecturing to you guys and my brain is like all over the place. I'm trying to remember what to say. I'm trying not to walk into people or get run over by a car, and I'm trying to look for cool photos and take photos of them. And then I also distracted myself with the delicious gelato. So this isn't really a good example of what to do, but let's talk about some tips on how to cultivate mindfulness, right? And there really are not many. There's just a couple that I keep in mind. And the first one is, don't have your phone on, or don't look at your phone, or put it on, silent mode, or do not disturb or something. Because the biggest distraction when it comes to mindfulness is your phone, easily. Like as messages pop in and things come in, and you're always checking in and that thing, right? Another one that I like to say is, or I like to give a tip about, or a tip that I have is, don't listen to music. I used to listen to music often when I went out to do photography, but that actually is kind of detrimental, I find, because music in itself is distracting. It gives you a mood that may not necessarily fit with what you're doing, with what you're shooting at that moment, or the environment you're in. And also it ends up leading to more messing with the phone, because you gotta like change the track, or the volume's too loud, or whatever it might be. Let's keep going this way. And let's get off even this street. I want to get on the real calm side streets here. There's a couple of particular places I want to find on this walk today. So yeah, and then the last one I would say is be hungry. I try not to be like physically actually hungry. I think it's a good idea to not eat too much before you go shooting, because when you're really full, you're kind of sluggish, and then you don't really feel like doing anything. And also when you're a little bit hungry, I feel like the senses are heightened. I'm a little bit more sharp, because it kind of makes sense. If you're hungry, your brain is in like hunter mode, like you got to find food, but also helps you to pay attention to your surroundings and to the moment, right? Of course, if you're too hungry, it's distracting as well. So it's like there's like a kind of middle ground there. But the most important tip, those are like little kind of fun, practical side tips, but the most important tip is, for practicing mindfulness, is don't be distracted by the camera. And that's what I feel like maybe a lot of beginner photographers, I'm certainly guilty of this when I was starting out, that's the biggest hurdle, is you end up focusing on your camera all the time. You're always fiddling with the settings, changing lenses. This is why prime lenses are so good. I'm going to shoot this. This is quite gorgeous. But prime lenses are so good because they give you less options. So you have less stuff to think about, and therefore you can focus more on the surroundings, on the environment, on the moments around. And also this is why, although I don't think settings themselves are that important in and of themselves, like you don't need to always have the perfect settings and dial everything in, you do need to actually, we should go this way, I think. The place I want to head to is kind of in this direction. But in terms of settings, you need to be very confident with camera settings so you can do them without thinking about them. That's what I'm getting at. They need to be second nature. And this is why I've talked in other videos that I like to have like a fast mode and a slow mode, where I kind of just have sort of two ways to shoot depending on the situation. And I don't need to think too much about exactly all my settings. Everything's already kind of preset. It's also why some people ask me like, do you change the white balance when you're shooting? And it's like, no, I don't, because I'm shooting on RAW. I can change the white balance later. It gives me one less thing to worry about. So yeah, the idea is try to make the camera as undistracting as possible. That also brings me to the last, reminds me of why I complain about these little nitpicky things about the Z6, when I've complained like, but the 3D tracking mode is not, the subject tracking mode is a little different than 3D tracking, or like the metering's a little bit finicky sometimes. I'm not going to get into these things in this video, but the reason those matter so much to me is because when they don't do what I want, it's distracting. It takes me out of the mindfulness mentality and then, focusing on the camera instead of the environment. That about covers it for mindfulness, right? And how it relates to photography. But I also want to talk about flow. Now, some of you may have heard of flow. This is like a psychological, like mental state. And basically, to sum it up, it's like being in the zone. It's like, when you're working on something, it could be, with your hands, like you're making something, you're painting, or you're working at the computer even. Like it happens to me when I'm doing like web design work sometimes. You get really in the zone, and then before you know it, like 3 hours pass, and you don't even remember what you did, but you do have a lot of work done, and it was very good, and you feel very good about it. That's flow. I'm sure most people have experienced this. It doesn't only happen with work. I mean, like, I think, video games and sports, you could argue, also produce these kinds of states. The point is you're just in the zone. And the way you achieve being in the zone, like the kind of how would I say, like the conditions that are needed to get into a flow state. One of them is that the level of challenge needs to be just right. So like it can't be, whatever you're doing can't be too easy or too hard. If it's too easy, you're going to be bored, and if it's too hard, you're going to be frustrated, right? It needs to be just right. 1 second, this is a beautiful tree here. But not so much the whole tree, but that shadow is just incredible. All right. And so the first thing, like I said, the most important thing, or like the main thing, is the level of challenge needs to be just right. But then you also need a certain level of focus. Like you need to be focusing on what you're doing, right? If there are distractions and whatnot, you don't fall into that flow state. You keep getting knocked out of it. And this is where it gets a little bit confused, I would say, for some people. And actually, I initially confused it as well with mindfulness. And when I learned about mindfulness, I thought I learned about flow first. Well, mindfulness is just like a kind of flow, right? It's the same thing, different word. But then I came to realize after thinking about it more that they are not the same thing, and they are related, and they kind of complement each other, but they are in fact quite different. And the difference is that mindfulness is like a state of awareness about oneself, like your internal thought process or your environment. You're focused on the present. Flow is you're like in the present, but you're not focusing so much about it anymore. You get lost. You lose the sense of self, right? So there's that difference, that sort of distinction. But the way they complement each other, and this is where I'm going to bring it back now to photography for you guys, is that I find that the best, like, of course I want to be in a state of flow. Who doesn't want to be in the zone when you're doing your art form like photography? But it's very hard to get in the zone because of distractions, as I already mentioned. So by practicing mindfulness, when you're out doing street photography, I find that I easily enter into the zone, into this flow state. So I'll be mindfully exploring the area I'm in, wherever it is, and then naturally I'll find things that are very fascinating to shoot, and then I'm in the zone, then I'm flowing, I'm just doing that thing, I'm changing the settings, everything is like automatic, and I'm creating these images and everything is going great. So that's where the two states come together and become sort of this one cohesive sort of, I don't know what to say, like strategy or something, or I guess mental state when it comes to street photography. So I guess that's the point. That's why I wanted to mention this to you guys. I'm gonna shoot this cool door here. It's not that interesting as I often say, but it's kind of neat. I would say with different light, this would be better. Yeah, and I don't feel that in the zoneness right now, like the flow or mindfulness, because I'm narrating what I'm doing. And that takes a lot of my attention. Like for example, with flow, as I said, you lose the sense of self. But when I'm making one of these videos and I'm explaining what I'm doing and I'm talking, I'm actually very consciously aware of myself, of what I'm saying and what I'm doing. So it's never really quite a flow kind of experience, right? So I can't really like demonstrate it on camera as I do many of the other things I talk about here, where I can demonstrate a photo technique or, whatever it might be, right? Or camera technique or something. But I assure you it exists, and I encourage you to practice it, which is why I gave you some basic tips. And to reiterate those, kind of summarize them, remove distractions like your phone. Also, another one I didn't mention is if you have something on your mind that's bothering you, write it down, send an email to yourself, and deal with it later so that you're not thinking about it as you're shooting, right? Don't be too hungry, but don't be too full. And of course, don't focus too much on your camera. And accept what's going on in your environment without any judgment. I'm gonna shoot this Koban over here because it's just this sort of, it's not that retro, but I like it. Probably wish I had a wider lens for this one. I just like how the reddish or orangish bricks play with the color of the building behind, which has got this kind of minty green color. And again, you see, without judgment, it's not like, oh, is this good, is it not good? It's just, I see it, it captivates my eye, and I shoot it. And if I was alone, I would, noisy truck. If I was alone and just shooting it on my own, and it was fascinating enough, I might spend quite some time shooting this one subject. And usually in those moments, I lose that sense of self, right? That sense of awareness of myself and of time passing, and I just shoot. And then before I know it, hours pass. I think if I say anything else at this point, I'm gonna start repeating myself. And when I'm repeating myself and rambling, I think that means this is the end of the video. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed the walk around Yanaka and enjoyed the photos, and of course enjoyed these ideas that are, by the way, not my ideas. And I might have, to be really fair, like a little disclaimer, this is like my digestion of these ideas. So I learned about flow, and I learned about mindfulness, and I learned about meditation and some other things, and I kind of remixed everything in my brain, and I gave you my understanding of it. So if you disagree, or if you feel like, well, but on Wikipedia it says this, cool. Like, I'm not trying to claim to be some sort of authority on these things. It's just how I apply these ideas to my life and my photography, whether it's eating a gelato or doing street photography. And as always, or not always, but as often is the case with these more essay style videos, there is a blog post on my website, and there'll be a link in the description that you can, click on and read these things, basically the same ideas, but with a bit more detail and nuance and a bit less rambly. If you like reading instead of watching, check that out as well. All right, so thank you so much for watching. Thank you also to our sponsor, portraitmode.io, and thank you to everyone who supported us on Patreon. We really appreciate that. All right, so catch you guys in the next video, and remember, always challenge your eye.